Hey everybody, Bill Grismore here with 27 Virtual. Welcome to this video presentation. And in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the pre-NSX prerequisites. Like, what do I need before I even get to NSX, right? So let's take a look. So one thing I've noticed in talking about NSX is a lot of people are looking at NSX out there, but they don't really know vSphere networking basics, but yet they want to dive in and start doing NSX. Well, for sure, NSX is definitely very cool, and we want to just dive in. But before we do that, let's take a look at some things that we should know about some basic vSphere networking before we even come close to NSX. And in this video, I just want to show you very quickly what the defaults are. So what you're going to get by default when you actually go out there and install your ESXi host, from a networking perspective, what do I get? So first of all, we're going to purchase a server, and in that server, we're going to have some type of network cards. Now, these network cards might be something that I purchase separately that I actually install in the PCI bus, or these might be built-in network cards that are in the motherboard. Now, a little bit old school to start out with, we could go way back in time, but you're going to find a lot of people out there that have actually built servers that are just 1 gig network adapters. That can be pretty common still even today. So let's just assume that we have 1 gig. And in another video coming up, we'll talk about 10 gig. And now there's 25 gig and 40 gig and 100 gig. Who knows where it's going to stop. But just for simplicity and for explanation's sake, we're just going to say we have 1 gig adapters. When I install ESX on this server, that's on the VMware hardware compatibility list, I have 2 adapters, both 1 gig. What I get by default is I get a vSphere standard switch. So that's the first thing that we want to talk about, is the standard switch that we get. So the name of that switch is vSwitch 0. That is the standard switch that we're going to get. And in that switch, we get something called a port group. So we'll just label this guy PG. Now, the name of this port group by default, this default port group that we get, is called VM network. And you can rename that default port group to anything you want. The name doesn't really matter that much. It's more the VLAN that we assign to it. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the next thing we need to do is when we build our ESXi server is we need to assign an IP address to it so we can connect to it and manage it and start configuring it. Maybe we deploy vCenter on top of it. So during the installation, you get a couple choices for how you get the actual IP address installed. You can assign an IP address statically, or you can let the server reboot back up and receive an IP address from a DHCP server that sits on this network segment where we have some type of a pool of IP addresses available to be assigned. Let's just say that we assign a static IP address. The static IP address gets assigned to something called a VM kernel NIC. So whatever that IP address is that we assign, does not get assigned to the actual underlying adapters. So these network cards down here in your host do not receive an IP address. So if you have like a Windows or a Linux background, what we're used to doing is taking the IP address and assigning it to a particular network adapter that lives in that server, or binding the IP address to the adapter, if you will. In the vSphere environment, since on an ESXi host we have a switch, the adapters that sit in the host essentially just become uplinks into that switch. It's almost like I have, if I were to make a comparison, if I have a physical switch and this physical switch wants to talk to another physical switch, in order for the switches to connect to each other, we need to have an uplink port that we're going to leverage to connect these 2 switches together. And an uplink port is just a port. You don't ever assign an IP address to a port. You assign IP addresses to network cards. Well, these adapters that sit inside your ESXi host, they are network cards. They are. And they have MAC addresses, just like any network card would have. But the purpose of these adapters in an ESXi host are simply to connect this host out to 2 other switches for fault tolerance if I have 2 cards. So what I would do is connect 1 adapter to the uplink port in this switch and 1 adapter to the uplink port in this switch. So we have our two uplink ports in our physical switch. If you think about the picture I have drawn, this is the switch. So then the question is, where are the uplink ports? Well, they're right here. The physical adapters in your ESXi host actually become the uplinks to your virtual switch. So let me back some of these arrows. I got a lot of arrows here. So what we have down here, if I can clean all this out, what we have down here are these adapters, and this would be the physical representation of those adapters. Now those adapters are going to be sitting in the switch here logically as well. And we're going to have adapter 0 and adapter 1. That's to represent them physically. And then logically, in the switch, we're also going to add adapters 0 and 1. So what I need to do is when I install my host, I have to determine what physical adapters are going to become the uplinks into my virtual switch. And then I'm able to make that connection out to another external switch or two for fault tolerance. And then these physical adapters here in the host are your uplinks. So when you assign an IP address to an ESXi host, the IP address does not get assigned to the actual physical adapters in the server like you might think it would with a traditional Windows or Linux server. Instead, the IP address is getting bound to this VM kernel NIC. So what is a VM kernel NIC then? So the VM kernel NIC is just a virtual network card that plugs into the kernel of the operating system. If I were to try to represent it logically, we could almost just draw like a network card, let's say, something that would like plug into a bus. But instead of it plugging into a bus, it's actually plugging into the kernel of the host, the VM kernel, so, or your operating system. So let's just imagine this little squiggly line right here is your ESXi operating system or your hypervisor. So essentially what it is a network adapter. It's a virtual network adapter. It's a software construct that actually plugs into the VM kernel and kind of creates like a stub, if you will, from a programming background, some kind of a connection into the kernel that we can actually create. And then what also happens by default when you build your server, your ESXi host, when you do the install, you get another port group, and you get a specific port in this port group that this adapter is going to plug into. So it's a very interesting concept. So this port right here is actually referred to as being a VM kernel port. So we have a VM kernel NIC, and we have a VM kernel port. And sometimes we refer to this connection here as a virtual wire that actually connects them together. We could also make the same type of an analogy for a virtual machine that would have a network card. And the virtual machine's network card would plug into a port here in the port group on VM network, our default port group. And this connection from the virtual machine's VNIC, let's label this as a VNIC, would then plug into this port here, whatever that port number is, let's say it's port number 1, in that VM network port group. So that's what we get by default. An ESXi host with vSwitch 0, with a port group called VM network, and a VM kernel port. And this VM kernel port by default is a VM kernel port for management. So we'll just say MAN for management. That connection right there, that configuration I should say, combined with the fact that these uplinks connect out to uplink ports on your physical switches, we just kind of complete the picture here. And then I'm sitting somewhere in the network with my laptop or desktop or some kind of physical machine, and I have a physical computer that's going to plug into some type of a port. And this port could be a cabled port. Of course, I could be on Wi-Fi, of course. And I'm going to make this connection in from my physical machine onto this switch. So I'm plugged into a regular access port there. So this would be my physical computer that's actually connecting into that port. And once this is complete, now I have the ability from a management perspective to actually make a connection, directly to this host. So I can use the vSphere client. There's now even a Fling for the web client to connect. I believe that's actually available now widely with the latest versions that we have out there with the new releases with 6.5 and whatnot. But that's a basic configuration that we would get by default. And from this point, then I could actually build my very first VM that would be my vCenter VM and my platform services controller, and I can start building out my environment, assuming I have available storage and those basic type of things that I need to get started. All right, so there you go. There's a basic look at what I get by default before I ever even think about installing NSX. But understanding some of these basics is really important if I'm more maybe coming from a network background and maybe I don't have so much of a vSphere background, but I still want to put NSX in my environment. I want to kind of own and control that. I don't know if there's anything else here really to add. Only other thing I could really think of maybe is in order for things to really work correctly, I would probably at some point here put a VLAN tag on this port group and put a VLAN tag on this port group. And then I would trunk those VLANs out here just to make sure we understand how the connection would go all the way through. Right, and then this machine here connecting to management would be on that same VLAN as the management network, just like that. Okay, that's all I got for now. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you.